And what we have here in chapter 14 is Paul and Barnabas going to Iconium. Let's notice verses 1 through 7. And it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake, that a great multitude both of the Jews and also of the Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. Long time, therefore, abode they, speaking boldly in the Lord, which gave testimony unto the word of the grace, of his grace, and granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, in part held with the Jews, in part with the apostles. And when there was an assault made, both of the Gentiles and also of the Jews, with their rulers, to use them despitefully and to stone them, they were ware of it, and fled unto Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth round about, and there they preached the gospel. Paul and Barnabas preached at Iconium among the Jews and the Gentiles, and we're told here that a great number of the people believed as a result of their teaching the gospel. Now, Iconium was located about 90 miles from Antioch of Pisidia. Now, they came from Antioch of Syria. That was their home base for their mission work. But Iconium and Antioch of Pisidia, both of those cities, plus Lystra and Derbe, were all located in the Roman province of Galatia. Now, Galatia, of course, was one of the areas where Paul wrote his letter with that name, Galatia, but he wrote it to the churches of Galatia. There were several churches in that area. Now, at the time, Iconium was a large city, and it was known by the name of Konya. Today, it's known by that name. Also, Konya, and it is in central Turkey. So it is a city yet today still in existence, but it is not as large of a place today as it was then. Now, at the time Barnabas and Paul were preaching, there was an obvious Jewish settlement. Now, how can you tell when you're reading about places where either Paul and Barnabas or Paul and Silas would go, how can you determine through the reading that there was a sizable Jewish section of people?
By the synagogue.
By the synagogue. If there were a certain amount of Jews there, they would have a synagogue. If not, they would meet on the riverbank or wherever they would be. So there was a synagogue there, and so they went to the synagogue and they preached. And however, though they were successful in their preaching of the gospel, there was a section of the unbelieving Jews. They didn't like it. They did not appreciate Paul and Barnabas coming in there and in their minds perverting God's religion. And so they stirred up some problems. Now, this is the beginning of this big fiasco that we're going to read about in the following chapter. And so they get together. They're going to stir up the people. And they were about evenly divided in what side they fell on. Now, we're going to notice that as they were preaching, they performed some miracles, some signs. Now, who is given the credit for performing these signs? Who does it say performed these signs and these miracles? God did. God did. And He did it through, though, Paul and Barnabas. And so Paul and Barnabas was the medium through which these miracles and these signs were performed. And that's the same way that the gospel is preached. The people We are the medium through which the gospel is spread. The message, obviously, is a heavenly message. It comes from heaven. God is the source, but God's not doing the preaching personally. The Holy Spirit's not doing the preaching. Some angel is not doing the preaching. It is done through the medium of people. We spread that. That's the way it has always been. Now, the Jews of verse 2 here were those who refused to obey the gospel. And notice that when a person refuses to obey the gospel, what they are doing is they are refusing to allow themselves to be persuaded by the gospel. Now, we're not talking about people who are atheists in this context. We're not talking about people who do not believe in the God of heaven. We are talking about religiously minded people who do believe and did believe in the exact same God Paul believed in. Believed in the God who began the redemption process with the nation of Israel. They simply refused to be persuaded to obey the gospel. Now, for what Luke described as a long time, the two remained in Iconium preaching the gospel. And their words were spoken in the Lord, meaning they spoke by inspiration. So they weren't just coming up with some kind of a personal idea on what they thought they ought to preach. The Lord worked with them, providing these signs and these wonders. And again, through that, we understand the very purpose for miracles, to prove the person doing the speaking is from God, the truthfulness of the message. But again, the population was divided. You had part for the apostles and part against them. Now, they're described as apostles. How can Barnabas be described as an apostle? I thought Paul was the only apostle. He was one that was sent out. These two men were apostles of the church of Antioch of Syria. Now, there was one in the group that was an apostle of Jesus Christ. Epaphroditus was referred to as a messenger in Philippians 2:25. That is the exact same word that is translated apostle in this text. It's the exact same word. Regarding Epaphroditus, it's translated messenger. And so these men were apostles of the church of Antioch. Now, obviously, Paul was an apostle of Christ. Now, this opposition continued against Paul and Barnabas until an assault was made. They wanted to get their hands on them and they wanted to murder these men. They wanted to stone them to death. And that is the reason that we know that the Jews were behind this. They wanted to stone them. Who does stoning? Jews. The Jews do the stoning. And so they left. They got out of there before they could carry that out, reaching Lystra and Derbe in the district of Lycaonia. They continued their preaching. Now, Lystra was about 18 miles from Iconium. Derbe was about 20 miles east of Lystra. And so they continued with their preaching. So we have verses 8 through 18, Paul and Barnabas at Lystra. Let's read that. And there sat a certain man at Lystra. He was impotent in his feet, being crippled from his mother's womb, who never had walked. The same heard Paul speak, who steadfastly beholding him and perceiving that he had faith to be healed. Now that's an important statement. Said with a loud voice, stand upright on thy feet, and he leaped and walked. And when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. And they called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. When the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates, and would have done sacrifice with the people, which when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard, they rent their clothes and ran in among the people, crying out, and saying, Sirs, why do ye these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that ye should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these things scarce restrained they the people, that they had not done sacrifice unto them. Now, Brother McGarvey had stated that these people in this area, they had they were so separated from the larger areas that they had retained a lot of their primitive habits and their dialect, and that's why they behaved in such a way that they behaved. But they got to Lystra. They met this man who was a lame man from his birth, and so they healed him. And because of this miracle, the people thought they had Jupiter and Mercury on their hands. And so they come out and speaking in this foreign language that was different from where Iconium, they came out praising them, and notice that Paul was able to communicate with these folks. Why? He was an apostle. He had all 9 of the gifts. He could both interpret and speak foreign languages that he had never heard. He had never studied. And so but at any rate, Paul, as he came to see this man who was crippled, he was lame, the text tells us he perceived in this man that he had enough faith that he would heal him, that would work. Now, all this time that we've talked about miracles, what have we always said? It's got nothing to do with the person being healed. It's always got to do with the man doing the healing, because that proves, because, we talk about these faith healers. What's the first thing they say? You have to have faith. It's because of you. But now we're reading right here that Paul perceived in this man that man had enough faith that this miracle would work, or it would happen. Well, obviously, what we've got here is God can heal who he wants to heal. I mean, how much faith can a dead person have? A dead person has no faith. They know nothing about what's going on in this world under the sun. Solomon taught that. But here's the thing, and we have to study the Bible, and we have to read and logically understand and deduce what's being said. If a person, and he's dealing with these people who are idol worshipers and they're pagans, okay? If someone comes out and they just completely resist God, and they have no interest in listening to what a man of God like Paul had to say, is God, and Paul perceives that, is he going to carry on with the action of healing a man? If they are going to completely reject God in every way, is Paul going to continue with that, or is he going to move on and he's going to do something else? See, he perceived in the man that he would have faith to believe what Paul had to say. And that's the indication that we have here. He wasn't dealing with a hard-hearted, hard-headed individual. And that's what Luke is getting across when he's talking about this interaction that Paul had in the person. So it's more of an attitude on the part of the individual that he was about to heal, is what Luke is talking about. But they call Paul Mercury here because he was the chief speaker. They called Barnabas Jupiter. Now that's the Greek name for Zeus, or Zeus is the Greek name for Jupiter, and that may be it may be that Barnabas was a larger man than Paul, is why they gave him the name of the superior God. Maybe one of the reasons. But when they realized their intention, they tore their clothes and they became upset, and they kind of let their emotion get ahead of them a little bit. And if you notice, as you read through the New Testament and you read the accounts of the apostles, how often do you see the apostles lose handle on their emotions and tear their clothes and run out and see this behavior like this? I don't know that we've ever seen it before this. I don't know that we've ever seen it after this. Now, Paul wasn't rebuked for this, and I don't blame Paul for this. This was a kind of a unique situation. But notice when Peter went to Cornelius' home, and Cornelius fell down before Peter and began to worship him, he didn't seem to lose control of his emotion, did he? Well, this is kind of a different situation. They were going to burn sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. Again, God did not rebuke Paul for this at all. And we don't see an example of this ever happening again. But this was a unique situation where all of a sudden you have a whole town coming in and claiming that you are a god, and they are going to worship you and burn sacrifice to you, and I can see that being an issue. But we don't see that ever happening again. Paul and Barnabas were hardly able to restrain the people from doing that. And he explained to them in time past, God was patient with the Gentiles, overlooking to the cross until Christ came, but now he demands everyone to repent. We're going to notice that when we get over to Acts chapter 17. Yes?
This be example of a visual example of what Paul says in Romans when they say, when you baptize this person, God forbid, should we continue in sin when grace abound? God forbid. It's like he's visually, or he's ripping his clothes, like, don't worship us. We're not the God you need to worship. Like that kind of.
I think I think probably in Romans 6 he was probably a little excited. In Romans 6 verse 1 is what you're talking about there. But I think he was really excited in Acts 14 here.
Ripping of the mantle would show you violent outburst of a person's emotions.
Oh, very emotional.
Something's fixing to happen.
Yeah, he had to stop what he had to prevent what was about to happen. They were going to offer a sacrifice to him as a god. And he said, you have to put away these vanities. What he was talking about were idols. You have to put away these idols and stop worshiping. Don't turn Barnabas and myself into an idol. You must worship the true God of heaven. He created the universe and all that is in the universe. You must turn to him and worship him. Good comment. Anything else? Yes, he had to be very fervent in explaining to these pagans because they didn't understand anything else. So he had to get, and that's why I say this is a very unique situation. When you had Peter and Cornelius, you had Cornelius, a practicing Jew, either a practicing Jew or a proselyte. And so he understood. Cornelius was caught up in some emotion. He knew you couldn't worship a man. He was practicing the old law. That was within the first 3 10 commandments. You can't have any other gods besides the God of heaven. He knew better than that. So even the Apostle John got caught up in the emotion when he was recording the revelation of Christ and fell down to worship an angel. And the angel had to say, see here that you don't do that. So, you can get caught up in an emotion and make a mistake, but this was different. This was the people of Lystra had really gotten out of hand. Sure, yeah. Yeah, it shows a release of emotion and that he meant business. We can't allow this to happen. It was a real ordeal. All right, let's look.
We don't carry a mantle today, but we will get somebody to teach you something like that. What do we do?
Yeah, you might slam your.
Something to get their attention.
Yeah, exactly. So he had to grab their attention. It was a unique situation. Good comments. All right, notice we're going to look at verses 19 through 28. This is the conclusion of the missionary journey of the first one. Now, it is, and we know this through life, it's amazing how a short period of time can change things. We go from a group of folks wanting to worship and burn sacrifice to these two men to wanting to kill them. Not to be outdone, these certain hateful Jews from Antioch and Iconium, they followed Paul and Barnabas to Lystra. And they did successfully persuade these Lycaonians to stone Paul. They were trying to get rid of the man. So just a short time before, these same people who were wanting to burn sacrifice and wanting to worship him changed their minds. Now what we learn here, and this is important, unless, let me put it this way, people who are not committed to the gospel are very fickle. They're very wishy-washy. We see that in the Galatians letter. I am astonished, Paul said, that you are so soon removed from the gospel, which is not the gospel. We see the letter to the Hebrew Christians. They're ready to go right back to this old law that's been done away with. It's no longer in effect. But they weren't dedicated to the gospel. We see it in individuals. Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. Paul wrote that. And so people can be very fickle. We can go back and look at the Lord's triumphant entry into Jerusalem. They were hailing him as a hero, and it wasn't just a little while later they were screaming for him to be crucified. So these people weren't dedicated to the gospel like they should have been. And at the same time, they might have been a little embarrassed and a little ashamed that they misidentified Paul and Barnabas. They recognized them to begin with as gods. Come to find out they were just men. And so maybe they were trying to save face a little bit. So the euphoria of the miracle was gone, and perhaps these hateful Jews had come in and said, oh, you've been tricked. You can't trust these fellas. You didn't investigate the cripple man enough. They're shysters, and so they have fooled you and got them all stirred up, and that's what the Jews are really good at, getting people stirred up. And so again, we look at what happened here. They stoned Paul. They dragged him out of the city and they left him for dead. And again, who does the stoning? The Jews. The Jews instigated it. They came over. They got everyone stirred up. They thought they had gotten rid of Paul. They drug him out. And even the disciples were standing around thinking, poor old Paul, he's dead. You know what? They had killed Paul. Paul was dead. And I think Paul was talking about himself when we get over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And he talks about that man I knew I think he says above 14 years ago or something like that, who had gotten caught up to the third heaven. Well, that's paradise. The third heaven is paradise. Paul, I think he was talking about himself. He'd gotten caught up to the third. He'd gone into paradise. You know how you get to paradise? You die. And so they had killed poor old Paul, in my opinion. And the Lord said, no, Paul, we're not finished yet. So he sent him on back. And all of a sudden, Paul jumped up, rose to his feet. He and the disciples went right back into town. The next day, they left town. But they didn't stop. He made the 20-mile trek out of town. And he went to Derby, and he continued to preach. And then they began their trip on back home. Now listen, their traveling wasn't as easy as our traveling is today. So that first 20-mile trek was pretty rough on him. He'd just been killed. So he wasn't feeling too good. But he made that trek, and he preached on the way. And on the way back, they headed back to Antioch of Syria. They visited those same cities that they had been to on the way, confirming the disciples, encouraging them. And those places were Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. And they continued to preach. They were conferring spiritual gifts and checking on the brethren. And Paul reminded the brethren, and if anyone can remind the brethren of this, Paul was the man. You will suffer persecution, but you have to remain faithful, and then you can enter into the heavenly abode. Now, if you remember as well, Acts chapter 12, or 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul said that when people who had gone into that third heaven, into paradise, what did he say about talking about that when you got back? Do you recall? Not lawful. Not lawful to speak of those things. You recall the name Mary Baker Eddy? She wrote the book. What was her religion? Adventist. Paul said he went up to the third. I believe it was Paul. Said he went up to the third heaven and got back. He says not lawful to talk about it. She said she went up to the third heaven and she couldn't be quiet about it. She wrote a book. I'm going to take Paul's word for it. I think she was telling something wasn't true. Anyway, yes.
About the time of the stoning in Lystra, or even the beginning of the missionary journey, is there a date about they think the journey started?
Absolutely, and I failed to put that in my notes. I had to go back. Look, I don't have. Let me see if I can look it up real quick. First missionary journey. You know what? Let me try to get that for you after class. We'll run out of time. That may be correct. That may be. I'd have to look. I had no reason not to think that's true, but because I think Paul died probably somewhere around 65, somewhere around in there, 66, something like that. But anyway, Paul reminded the brethren they had to be faithful. But as he traveled through, and he came back through conferring these gifts, he had to confer these gifts because enough time had not elapsed for these elders that had been appointed to have developed enough to, today when we appoint elders, they've had a little time in the seat, haven't they? They have a little experience, a little wisdom, and we gain wisdom through obviously study of the Word of God, but wisdom comes in different ways. A lot of our wisdom comes through just time, experiences, good and bad. And so these men had not had enough time to gain wisdom, the kind of wisdom you have to be an elder. And so they had to have these gifts, and Paul gave them. And so They boarded a ship in Perga. They journeyed to Attila, they journeyed to Attila, boarded the ship there, went to Antioch, and they had fulfilled their mission. And the thing is, they had preached to the Gentiles, and Paul and Barnabas had remained a long time with the saints in Antioch. Any comments, questions?
The preacher one time talked about this. Elders, had a guy coming that never obeyed the gospel, attended regularly, but never obeyed the gospel. He asked him why he had never obeyed the gospel and been baptized. He said, well, I don't understand the qualifications of an elder. The preacher said, I guess he thought he was going to baptize him today and make him an elder tomorrow. That's his whole premise of not being baptized. He doesn't understand what an elder is.
Well, that's a poor reason. All right, chapter 15. Paul and Barnabas, they get back to Antioch. Beginning with verse 1, and certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. That's pretty point blank. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. And being brought on their way by the church, they passed through Phoenicia and Samaria, declaring the conversions of the Gentiles, and they caused great joy unto all the brethren. And when they were come to Jerusalem, they were received of the church and of all the apostles and elders, and they declared all things that God had done with them. But there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees, which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. So they get back and they're going to report. They get back to the home congregation, they're going to report, and certain men had come to Antioch from Judea, and they were teaching this doctrine of Satan. You've got to be circumcised. And what they were doing, they were setting up their personal opinion as doctrine. Now, would it have been wrong in and of itself if these Jewish men had said, hey, we're going to be circumcised? Well, no, if that's what you want to do, more power to you. But can they bind that on someone? Absolutely not. That's an opinion. And they were making it part of God's law. That is a sinful thing. And so it's just like the forbidding brethren. Listen, if you want to worship with a bunch of like-minded people that say we're going to drink out of one cup, you know what? Do it. I don't want to participate with you. I'm not drinking out of one cup. I don't want what you've got. And so unless I'm on the front row and I can be the first guy, I'm going to get up and go down the road and meet somewhere else. I've gotten used to the little bitty crackers that's already broken up. I don't even want the whole cracker anymore. I'm just paranoid. And so, but if that's what someone's thing is, great. Everybody used to be one cuppers way back in the day because that's all they had was one cup. Can you imagine? My grandmother used to dip rosebud snuff. That powder snuff, she had to carry a napkin around with her all the time because it was always running down her cheeks and would you want? I wouldn't want to drink after that.
Was she level-headed?
Huh?
Was she level-headed?
Oh,
Run out both
yeah.
sides.
And then my great grandmother just straight up chewed tobacco, spit in the coffee can all the time. I'm not interested in that. But if that's what somebody wants to do, that's great. You can do it, but don't tell me I have to do it. If you don't want to meet on Sunday evening, that's your business. But don't tell me I can't. If you don't want Bible classes, that's your business. But don't tell me I can. If you don't want a located preacher, more power to you. If you don't want to support orphans' homes or preacher schools, you don't have to. But don't tell me I can't. That's how you handle that. But these men were creating doctrine where God had not created it. Now, for us to appreciate the root of this problem, we have to understand what these men were thinking. Before the Jewish law was ever put into effect, and we can go all the way back to Genesis 17 forward, circumcision was demanded by God. So it was difficult for these men to lay that aside. But what do you have to do? You got to stop it. If God says stop it, you've got to stop it. And so when we study with people who come out of a denomination, we have to be a little patient with them as we study with them, because they've been doing something for the last 40 years. And so we have to be a little patient in our studying. But can we give over to them? No, we cannot. Someone says, well, you go to church with me, I'll go to church with you. Does God allow for that? Absolutely not. He does not allow for that. That's not how God handles things. But do we be patient with them? Absolutely, we're patient with them. They've been living that way for most of their lives. Their whole families were living that way. They've got great grandparents that have been dead for 200 years that were in that denomination. And that weighs on their minds. And, you know, our hearts ought to go out to them and break for them. I've got grandparents that were Mormons and every other kind of denomination. And you can't, you know, it's hard to get any more away from the Bible than that religion. You know, and that hurts my feelings thinking about it. But here's what I do know. When I study the rich man and Lazarus, and I use this a lot when I study with people, the rich man lifted up his eyes being in torments. He's not getting out of torments because there's this great gulf fixed, and Abraham said, you're not leaving. You can't leave. No one can come to you. But you know what was on his mind was he had 5 brothers back home, and he did not want his 5 brothers to join him in torments. So however bad torments is, it can be made a little worse if your family back home comes and joins you there. So let's don't go join them. That's the thing. And so these men had to stop doing what they were doing. Now, the focal point of this contention was circumcision. But it wasn't just circumcision. They wanted and demanded that they follow all of the law of Moses. That was really what they were getting to, chapter 15, verse 24. Now, we do know that to avoid unnecessarily offending the Jews, in chapter 16, verse 3, Paul had Timothy circumcised. That was an expediency because Timothy was Jewish. But when we study Galatians chapter 2, verses 3 through 5, the Jews tried to get him to have Titus circumcised. What was his answer for that? No. Why? Because then he would have been yielding to these Judaizing teachers unnecessarily, and it was not to unnecessarily offend, it was, I'm not yielding to your sin. So he said, Titus was a Greek. Had nothing to do with not unnecessarily offending someone. It was, I'm not yielding to your sin. So it's a little different. Expediency matters as long as you're not sinning. The Judaizers were false teachers from within the church. That's an issue. That's the most dangerous false teacher. Those who sneak in unawares, and Paul describes some of these false teachers that way in Galatians chapter 2, verses 4 through 5. Galatians chapter 2 is a mirror of the events of Acts chapter 15. And we learn a lot about what went on in Acts chapter 15 at this Jerusalem conference from Galatians chapter 2. And so the Pharisees had sent in spies to spy them out, to destroy their liberty, to put them back in bondage to the law of Moses, is what Paul said. And so because of this, they sent Paul and Barnabas along with some other brethren back up to Jerusalem. Now, was that even necessary? No, it was not necessary, because Paul was an apostle. He was chosen by Jesus personally he met all of the requirements, but Paul, wanting to keep peace and wanting always to do the right thing, he went. But not just because of that, he received a revelation. Jesus told him to go. You go on up there. You meet up there, because this thing needs to be handled and we need to put this thing to rest. So they traveled up there and they joined them and they met. Now, here's what we're going to notice. In both of the accounts, Paul and Barnabas are together, but in Galatians 2 and Acts 15, but this is the last time they're going to be together. They're not going to team up anymore after this. Because we recall what happened. Mark was with them on this first journey, and then I believe it was at Perga, he left and went home, didn't he? And it was obviously because of some kind of weakness on his part, and Paul couldn't stand that. And he was not going to allow that to happen again. And so they split up. Now, it's clear that these Judaizers came to Antioch, and we see that in Galatians chapter 2. Now, when these Judaizers came to Antioch, that is when Peter and Paul had their little dust-up. Do you recall what these Judaizers said? Who sent them to Antioch? You remember what they said? James. They came from James, by the authority of James. Now, this James is the Lord's half-brother. And for always, I've read that, and I said, that bothers me, and not just a little. That James would send those men up there to Antioch and telling those folks they have to be circumcised. Well, now when you study and you put everything together and you look at Acts chapter 15, you do a little more reading and you study like you probably ought to, like I hadn't been doing, you come to find out those men were liars. They were sent to Antioch by the authority of James, but then they exceeded their commission. James, we find out in Acts chapter 15, he never sent anyone up there. And he says James wasn't acting on his own. We didn't send anybody up there with that doctrine saying that these Gentile Christians had to be circumcised. So these Pharisees who had sent these spies into the church to stir up the trouble, cause a problem, go up to Antioch and tell them all kinds of lies. Tell them James sent you. Why would that make a difference? That James sent us.
One of the apostles.
Well, no, this is the half-brother of Jesus, but he was well respected. Paul called him a pillar in the church, likely an elder in the church at Jerusalem. We're not told that, but very likely one of the elders, because he was in the conference, he was in the meeting, and he spoke. And it was a conference for the apostles and the elders. And so he was likely an elder. And so it's apparent that they lied. And so they sent him on the way. They got to the Jerusalem council, verses 6 through 21. Barnabas reported. Barnabas spoke first. Now that's kind of important, because now we see Barnabas listed first. Back in 13 we started seeing Paul listed first. Well, Barnabas was well known in Jerusalem, if you'll remember, and Paul not so much. And what they did know about Paul was that guy called Saul. And he was the one who was killing everybody. And Barnabas took him around and he introduced him to everybody and they accepted him. But everybody knew Barnabas, everybody loved Barnabas, and everybody respected Barnabas. Plus, that gave Paul the opportunity to kind of give the closing statements. And so they spoke and they talked about what happened on their missionary journeys and how they had preached to the Gentiles and how they had worked the miracles. And that's a sign from God. And so we learned that the meeting began with this. We see much disputing. The dissenters, no doubt, pressed their point and others took issue with them. But it wasn't only Paul and Barnabas who was opposed by these Pharisees. Peter was too, because who was the first one to preach to the Gentiles? Peter. So they didn't like that. But Peter got up. He began by calling their attention to when he went to the house of Cornelius. Now, they would have well remembered that. And then Peter made a pointed remark about why the Pharisees, why would you want to put a yoke on the neck of these saints that either we nor our fathers could stand? Why would you, in other words, he's saying, why do you want to take them back to the Old Testament? There was only one person who could ever live up to that, and that was the Lord. And now you're wanting to bind all of that mess back on us again after now we have the liberty of the New Testament covenant. So he was drawing their minds back to that. Then he stated it's through grace, the grace of Christ, the one who can save us, and it both Jew and Gentile. It's through this process of the system of grace, the gospel, not through the law of Moses, that we're saved. And so what had happened, they had first introduced what was going on when they first got there, and then the elders and the apostles kind of went and had a meeting together and discussed this thing, and then they came back out to the congregation, and then they explained what they had come up with, what their decision was. Now here's what we have to remember. This wasn't a decision that just those elders and apostles decided. Those men were inspired. And by being inspired means God was talking to them. So what these men came out and they revealed what they were inspired to say. So really, from where did the message come? From God. It came from heaven. So this is God speaking. And so the congregation was assembled. Luke reported the multitude kept silent and listened to Barnabas and Paul. Even the Pharisees were put to silence. They had to keep their mouths shut. And again, this is Barnabas' name first, suggesting he was the first speaker. He spoke. He talked about what had gone on, about confirming the gospel. Then James spoke. Again, this is the half-brother of Jesus. And he reminded the brethren of what Peter, called Simeon here, had done in his speech. He reminded them it was in harmony with the Old Testament's prophets, and he cited Amos chapter 9, verses 11 through 12. But notice he used the plural prophets. He didn't just quote from Amos. He kind of put together a montage of several prophets' statements. And he talked about the tabernacle of David. Now, he wasn't talking about the Jewish system. It's never been called the tabernacle of David, the Jewish system. Now, if he wanted to talk about the Jewish system, he might have said the tabernacle of Moses. He was talking about the house of David. He's talking about the lineage of David. Now, he wasn't talking about the kingly lineage, because you remember a guy named Coniah? He was taken off of the throne. He was sent to Babylon as a prisoner. And I think it was Jeremiah, wasn't it, said that there'll never be another one from his lineage ever sit on the throne again in Judah. Guess who came through his lineage? Jesus. It was David, then Jeconiah, a man by the name of Jesus. So if Jesus ever sits on a throne, a literal throne, it'll never be on this earth. So his throne is a spiritual throne. But James, an inspired prophet, stated the official decree. Now let's remember, it's not a decision reached by men. He showed the Gentile Christians were not to be troubled by requiring their obedience to the law of Moses. But here's what he did declare. He said it needed to be written down. A letter needed to be written, instructing them to abstain from idols, fornication, things strangled, and blood. And that letter was to be carried with the authority of the apostles. Now, the result, they sent those men back to Antioch. They sent some witnesses with them. And let's just talk for just a second. We'll end on this because we've gone over a little bit here. Let's talk about these things that were forbidden for these Gentiles. Most of it is self-explanatory, but I want to talk about this for just a second. We've always talked about forbidding the eating of meat offered to an idol. That's part of what we talk about when we talk about a scruple. That's talked about in 1 Corinthians and Romans. He forbade that for these Gentiles. Why would that happen? Well, that is a temporary expediency for these Gentiles, because let's look at their situation. They're pagans. They're coming out of a situation where they don't have any experience with the law of Moses. They don't have any experience with anything other than idol worship, period. And until they learn and become familiar with the gospel, the apostles demanded that you have nothing to do with idol worship at all. If they bring in some meat that was offered to an idol, you don't eat that meat. Period. Because you do not need anything that would draw you back to that idol worship. Now, once you learn about the gospel and you become more mature in the gospel and you learn more about it and you understand an idol doesn't mean anything, okay, then we can begin to practice those tenets about scruples, that an idol's nothing. If it doesn't violate your conscience, you can eat the meat. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, chapter 10. But what about this thing about not eating anything that's been strangled or eating blood? That's always been a tenet in every dispensation of time. Genesis chapter 9, you cannot eat blood. Why can you not eat blood?
Life is in the blood.
The life is in the blood. You can't eat blood. You can't eat things made. You can't eat blood sausage. You can't drain the blood. That's what the pagans would do. They would drain the blood out of an animal, and they would drink it or they would eat it. They'd make something out of it. The life is in the blood. You couldn't do it in the patriarchal age. You couldn't do it under the law of Moses. And here you can't do it in the Christian age. You cannot eat blood. You can't eat things strangled because that would violate this idea of draining the blood out of the animal. It would remain in the animal. You're supposed to drain the blood out of the animal. And so that's why they told them that. Now, that leads to 1,000 different questions. People say, well, can I eat a medium rare steak? Well, sure you can. That's not eating blood. You've drained the blood out of an animal. That's and I can't remember now what that liquid is called. It's not blood.
So it ain't blood.
It ain't blood. It's something else. Huh?
It begins with an A, and I can't.
Yeah, I've looked it up 1,000 times. But anyway, if you want to eat medium rare, if you want to eat raw meat, hey, that's your thing. Go for it. But anyway, the thing is, even if you don't eat it medium rare, you're still eating it. If it was blood, you're still eating it cooked. Is the thing. You just can't eat blood. He doesn't differentiate between it being cooked or not. So that's the thing. You just drain the blood. You can't eat strangled animals. So and then we get into the last part of the book, the dissension between Paul and Barnabas. That simply is pretty self-explanatory. It was over Mark. But here's what we know about that. Mark redeemed himself, and we read about that later on. He became a valuable partner with Paul, and he was Paul, in Paul's word, very useful to him. Sorry about going over. Any comments, questions? All right, I appreciate you. We'll pick up here next time. I'll bring the midterm. Angie, it'll be terrible.